Hey guys, tonight we are leaving the frantic buzzing of your smartphone and the blue light glare of the modern world behind as we step onto the sun-baked, dusty riverbanks of 9th century Baghdad. Imagine the heat shimmering off the Tigris River, a heavy, golden haze that tastes of cinnamon, river silt, and the faint, metallic tang of copper from the nearby smithies. You are standing at the threshold of the round city, a place where the air moves slowly, weighted down by the sheer volume of ideas being argued in every shaded corner. You probably won an Oppos. T survived this, not because of some swashbuckling desert peril, mind you, but because the pace of life here is so profoundly unhurried that your modern, dopamine-fried brain might actually experience a total system shutdown from the lack of, content. This is a world where, high speed, means a particularly determined camel. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Go ahead and drop your location and your local time in the comments. It's always a bit surreal to think about how far these stories travel while we're all tucked away in our own little corners of the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let an Oppos ease into tonight and Oppos journey together. You trudge through the Khurasan gate, your leather sandals making a soft, rhythmic thwack hush against the packed earth. The city of Baghdad, the jewel of the Abbasid Caliphate, rises around you in a series of perfect, concentric circles. It is a masterpiece of urban planning, though at the moment, you're mostly focused on the way the grit of the desert has found a permanent home between your toes. To your left, a merchant is haggling over the price of indigo-dyed silk, but his voice is just a distant murmur, a part of the city's white noise. You aren't here for the commerce or the chaos. You are moving toward the center, toward the heartbeat of the Golden Age. The sun is a heavy weight on your shoulders, but as you move deeper into the city, the architecture begins to offer its protection. High, mud-brick walls cast long, cool shadows that feel like a physical relief. You pass a small fountain where water trickles into a limestone basin, a gentle, repetitive sound that mimics the slow blinking of your eyes. You're heading toward the House of Wisdom, or Beit al-Hikmah. It is perhaps the most famous library in human history, though as you approach the unassuming entrance, you realize it doesn't and Oppos look like a gleaming temple of glass and steel. It looks solid. It looks quiet. It looks like the kind of place where a single sneeze would be considered a major historical event. The mainstream historical fact that everyone likes to toss around is that the House of Wisdom was formally established as a major intellectual hub by Caliph al-Ma'mun in the early 800s. He was a man obsessed with dreams, quite literally. Legend says he once dreamt of Aristotle, who told him that reason and revelation were totally compatible, which is basically the 9th century equivalent of a tech CEO having a, visionary, epiphany in a sensory deprivation tank. This led to a massive state-funded effort to collect every book in the known world. Imagine a government project that didn't an Oppos involve building a bridge to nowhere, but instead involved buying every scrap of Greek philosophy they could get their hands on. It's a wild concept, I know. As you reach the heavy timber doors, you notice a group of translators sitting in the shade of a nearby archway. They look exhausted, their fingers stained a deep, permanent charcoal color from the ink. Here is a quirky, fringe tidbit for you. During this era, the most elite translators were sometimes paid the literal weight of the books they translated in gold. If you were a particularly wordy scholar working on a hefty volume of Galen's medical theories, you were effectively set for life. It gives a whole new meaning to the term dense prose, If I were them, I'd be using the thickest parchment available and perhaps accidentally drifting into very long, descriptive tangents about the weather just to tip the scales. You pause at the entrance, letting your eyes adjust to the dim interior. The transition from the blinding white glare of the courtyard to the cool, amber-lit hallways of the library is like slipping underwater. The air inside is different. It's cooler, stiller, and smells intensely of beeswax, old leather, and a hint of dried mint. You find yourself walking on tiptoe, not because anyone has told you to be quiet, but because the silence here feels heavy, like a velvet blanket draped over your senses. Historians still argue whether the House of Wisdom was actually a massive, singular public library like we imagine today, or if it was more of a private administrative bureau and translation academy for the caliph's inner circle. Some suggest the "great library" might have been spread out across dozens of smaller villas and palace wings. But in this moment, as you stand in the vestibule, it doesn't matter. Whether it's one room or 100, the weight of a million handwritten thoughts is pressing down on the air around you. You look down at your hands and realize you've unconsciously slowed your breathing to match the stillness of the building. There are no scrolls buzzing, no notifications pinging, just the sound of your own heartbeat and the distant, muffled scratch of a reed pen somewhere deep in the stacks. It's the sound of knowledge being painstakingly copied one letter at a time before the invention of the select all and copy functions. If you think your job is tedious, imagine spending 3 years copying a book on geometry by hand, only to realize on the last page that you've misspelled the author and Apo's name. That's a level of Monday morning blues that modern science has yet to fully categorize. You begin to move forward, your footsteps swallowed by the thick rugs that line the hallway. The walls are lined with niches, and in each niche sits a bundle of scrolls or a stack of early codices, their spines bound in goatskin. You are in Apos, in a hurry. There is no deadline here. The Golden Age ISN and Apos, going anywhere for a couple of centuries, and for now your only task is to walk. You are drifting through the crossroads of the world, where Persian poetry rubs shoulders with Indian mathematics and Greek logic. It's a massive, silent dinner party where the guests have been dead for 500 years, but their ideas are still keeping the lights on. The hallway seems to stretch on forever, a labyrinth of thought and ink. You pass a window high up in the wall, where a single beam of light pierces the gloom, illuminating millions of dust motes dancing in the air. Each one looks like a tiny star. You watch them for a long time, mesmerized by their slow, chaotic tumbling. It's the most exciting thing you've seen in 20 minutes, and honestly, you're perfectly okay with that. Your heart rate is slowing. The tension in your jaw is melting away. You are sinking into the dust of ancient Baghdad, and the world outside the round city is starting to feel like a very loud, very distant dream. You step deeper into the throat of the building, and the transition is so abrupt it's as if you've walked through an invisible curtain of cold water. Behind you, the dry, rasping heat of the Baghdad streets is already becoming a memory, a distant fever dream of dust and shouting. Here, the walls are thick, layers of sun-dried brick and limestone that have spent decades absorbing the coolness of the night and guarding it like a secret. You press your palm against the stone of a nearby pillar, and the chill that seeps into your skin is almost startling. It's the kind of deep, structural cold that you only find in places built to outlast empires. The corridor stretches out before you, a long, rhythmic sequence of pointed arches that seem to march into a gentle, honey-colored gloom. There are no torches here. The smoke would ruin the precious ink. So the light comes from high, narrow clerestory windows that catch the sun and stretch it into long, thin rectangles across the floor. You watch your shadow elongate and then shorten as you pass through these pools of light. It's a very slow, very private game of hopscotch. You notice that the floor ISN and Apos, just flat stone. It's inlaid with geometric tiles in shades of turquoise and deep indigo. The patterns are so intricate they make your eyes cross if you stare too long, which is actually a great way to induce a nap, so feel free to keep staring. The mainstream historical fact that defines this space is its role as the epicenter of the translation movement. This wasn't just a few guys translating a couple of poems. This was a centuries-long, state-funded obsession with taking every drop of knowledge from the Greeks, Persians, and Indians and turning it into Arabic. It was the intellectual equivalent of a giant vacuum cleaner sucking up the world and Apos' wisdom. And yet, standing here, you don't feel that frantic energy. You just feel the stillness of the result. Thousands of books are resting somewhere in the dark, waiting for someone with more patience than a modern human with a 10-second attention span to come along and read them. You notice a faint, spicy scent hanging in the air. It's not just the old paper and leather from before. It's something sharper. Here is a quirky, Fringe tidbit for you. The shelves and doors in these corridors were often made of specially imported Lebanese cedar or even sandalwood, specifically because the resins acted as a natural repellent for bookworms and silverfish. The librarians were essentially using high-end aromatics as a 9th century version of pest control. It's a bit like living inside a very expensive cigar box, which is a surprisingly soothing thought as you continue your slow, aimless drift. Historians still argue whether the House of Wisdom was actually a single grand edifice, the kind of, great library, you see in movies with soaring domes and endless staircases, or if it was a more decentralized, administrative concept, spread across the city in various palace wings and scholars' homes. But as you walk these quiet hallways, the physical reality feels indisputable. The way the sound of your breathing echoes back at you suggests a massive, hollow space, a cathedral built not for a deity, but for the alphabet. You pass a small, recessed bench carved directly into the wall. It looks incredibly uncomfortable, the kind of seat designed by someone who believed that physical suffering was the only way to truly understand Greek metaphysics. You sit down anyway, just to see what it feels like. The stone is smooth and cold through your robes. There's a tiny crack in the tile across from you, and you spend several minutes tracing its path with your eyes. It looks a bit like a river delta, or maybe a very tired lightning bolt. In the silence of the library, this crack is the most fascinating thing in the world. You're starting to realize that when you take away the constant noise of the 21st century, the smallest details become monumental. I mean, honestly, you probably Haven and Oppos. Sat this still since the last time your phone died and you were forced to contemplate the back of a cereal box. It's a bit terrifying, ISN and Oppos. It, the lack of, stuff, to look at. But as you sit there, the phantom itch to check a notification begins to fade. You start to notice things you missed before. The way the light reflecting off a blue tile casts a faint, ghostly shimmer on the underside of an arch, or the way the air feels slightly heavier as it moves past the heavy tapestries hanging further down the hall. You imagine the scholars who have walked this same path. They probably Warren and Oppos. All solemn geniuses. Some of them were likely just very tired people who were looking for a quiet place to hide from their families or the midday heat. You can almost see them, men in heavy robes, carrying stacks of parchment, moving with that specific, hurried yet cautious gait of someone who is trying not to drop a priceless manuscript. If they had, terms and conditions, back then, they probably involved a very stern warning about not bringing sticky dates anywhere near the Aristotle section. By entering this library, you agree to not use the margins of the Almagest as a grocery list. You stand up, your knees giving a tiny, audible pop that sounds like a gunshot in the vacuum of the corridor. You freeze, waiting for a librarian to emerge from the shadows and shush you with the force of 1,000 suns. But no one comes. The silence here is remarkably resilient. It's not an empty silence. It's a full one. It's the sound of millions of words all holding their breath at once. You continue your walk, trailing your fingers along the wall. The texture changes from smooth limestone to a rougher, more porous brick. You're moving deeper into the archives now, away from the main thoroughfares. The light is dimmer here, the air a bit dustier. You find yourself thinking about that war of the books mentioned in the old stories, the idea that knowledge was so valuable that it was worth more than territory. In this corridor, that feels true. The world outside, with its wars and its taxes and its loud, demanding reality, feels flimsy compared to the solid, cool weight of these walls. You're not even halfway through the building, and already the modern world feels like a noisy neighbor you've successfully blocked. You are just a pair of eyes and a pair of feet, moving through a forest of stone and ink. The rhythmic tuk-tuk of your sandals on the tiles is the only clock you need. You aren't and Oppos, going anywhere important. You are just being. And in the 9th century, in the quietest corridor of the world's greatest library, just being is more than enough. You drift away from the cooling stone walls of the main corridor and into a chamber that feels lighter, almost airy, as if the very atoms of the building have exhaled. The scent here shifts dramatically. The heavy, resinous musk of Lebanese cedar and the damp chill of limestone give way to something crisp, vegetal, and faintly sweet. It's the smell of sun-dried grass and boiled starch, the unmistakable perfume of a revolution that doesn't use swords or shields, but pulp and water. You are standing in the heart of the paper repository, a place where the heavy, clunky past is being traded for a much more portable future. In front of you, stacked on low, polished benches, are the first fruits of the Samarkand secret. You reach out a hand, your fingers hovering just an inch above a stack of cream-colored sheets. Before this moment, if you wanted to record a thought, you usually had to find a very unlucky sheep or calf. Parchment and vellum were the gold standard, but they were also essentially leather. Writing a long-form philosophy book meant you were effectively dragging a small herd of livestock across the library floor. It was heavy, it was expensive, and let's be honest, it probably smelled a bit too much like a barn on a humid day. But here, under your touch, is something different. Paper. The mainstream historical fact that changed everything in this room was the Battle of Talas in 751 AD. Legend has it that among the prisoners taken by the Abbasid forces from the Chinese were skilled papermakers. These craftsmen were brought back to Samarkand and later to Baghdad, where they were essentially told, and quote, "Nice secret you've got there. It'd be a shame if no one used it to build a global empire of knowledge." End quote. By the time you're walking through these halls in the 9th century, Baghdad has its own paper mills and the cost of spreading an idea has plummeted. It's the 9th century equivalent of moving from expensive, dial-up landlines to high-speed fiber optics, only with more flowing robes and fewer annoying, end quote, connection lost, end quote, sounds. You pick up a single sheet. It's thicker than the paper you're used to in the 21st century. Sturdier with a slight organic, end quote, tooth, end quote, to the surface. It's made from recycled rags, hemp, and linen fibers, pounded into a slurry and dried on screens. You run your thumb along the edge, and it makes a soft, fibrous hush sound. This is the, end quote, new paper smell, end quote, of the medieval world. It's intoxicatingly clean. You probably won in Oppos, find any, end quote, scratch and sniff, end quote, stickers in these archives, which is a shame because a 9th century, end quote, fresh papyrus, end quote, scent would probably sell for a fortune in a modern candle shop. As you move deeper into the room, you see stacks of paper waiting to be, end quote, sized, end quote. Here's a quirky, fringe tidbit for you. To make the paper less absorbent so the ink wouldn't in Oppos, bleed into a messy blob, the craftsman coated it in a sizing made from rice or wheat starch. While this made the paper beautifully smooth and easy to write on, it also turned the library into a literal buffet for local rodents. Historians have found countless manuscripts with, end quote, nibbled, end quote, edges where a very hungry 9th century mouse decided that a treatise on Persian poetry looked a lot like a sourdough snack. You can almost imagine a frustrated librarian shaking a broom at a mouse that just ate the second half of a very important mathematical proof. End quote. No, Barnaby, that was the quadratic formula, not a cracker. End quote. The room is quiet, save for the occasional rustle of a page being turned by a scholar in a corner alcove. You find yourself standing near a window where the light catches the watermark-like texture of the drying sheets. Historians still argue whether the secret of papermaking was truly a, end quote, spoils of war, end quote, event at the Battle of Talas, or if it was actually a much slower, more boring process of technological diffusion along the Silk Road. Some scholars suggest that paper was already trickling into the Islamic world through peaceful trade for decades before the battle ever happened. But as a scriptwriter, I have to say, end quote, captured secret agents of the paper industry, end quote, makes for a much better movie trailer than, end quote, gradual economic shift over 40 years, end quote. You watch a scribe nearby who is preparing a new sheet for a translation of a Greek medical text. He ISN and Oppos, just writing. He's performing a ritual. He uses a smooth piece of glass or a polished stone to burnish the paper until it shines like silk. The sound of the stone sliding over the starch-coated surface is a rhythmic, hypnotic shlup shlup shlup. It's the ultimate ASMR experience of the 800s. You find your eyelids getting heavy just watching the repetitive motion. There is something profoundly calming about the fact that every single sheet in this room required hours of physical labor before a single word was even written. Compare that to our modern world, where we churn out thousands of digital pages per second that no one will ever read. Here, if you're going to spend 3 days making a piece of paper and another week polishing it, you'd better have something important to say. You probably wouldn't oppose. T waste this kind of effort on a, and quote, what I had for breakfast, and quote, blog post or a picture of a grumpy cat, unless that cat was a very high-ranking royal pet. In the House of Wisdom, brevity ISN and oppose. T just a virtue. It's a way to save your wrists from permanent carpal tunnel syndrome. You move to a long table where several bound volumes are lying open. These are codices, actual books with spines, rather than the long, awkward scrolls of the ancient world. Scrolls were the, end quote, VHS tapes, end quote, of the library world. If you wanted to find a specific quote at the end of the roll, you had to spend 10 minutes manually winding the thing while your hands cramped. The codex, however, is a revelation. You can just flip to the page. It's the ultimate user interface upgrade. You gently turn a page of a new manuscript, and the sound is a crisp, confident, and quote, snap, and quote. It's the sound of information becoming organized. The air in this section feels less like a tomb and more like a laboratory. It's the place where the raw materials of thought are being prepped. You lean against a wooden pillar, feeling the subtle vibration of the city outside, the distant, muffled calls of the market. But here, the only thing that matters is the grain of the paper. You're starting to realize that the, in quote, golden age, in quote, wasn't oppose, T just about big ideas. It was about the humble, starchy sheets that gave those ideas a place to sleep. You take one last deep breath of that clean, vegetal scent. It's clearing your head, washing away the mental clutter of your own time. You aren't an oppose. T worried about your inbox or your calendar. You are just a guest in a room full of potential, surrounded by thousands of blank pages waiting for their first drop of ink. The silence is no longer heavy. It's expectant. You feel a strange sense of peace knowing that these sheets will eventually carry the thoughts that will build the modern world. But for now, they are just resting in the quiet smelling of Samarkand and sunshine. You leave the airy, starchy brightness of the paper repository and slip through a heavy, leather-curtained doorway. The light here dies down to a soft, buttery glow, and the temperature drops another few degrees. You have entered the Translation Bureau, the engine room of the Golden Age. If the previous room was about the physical body of knowledge, this room is about its soul. The air is thick with the scent of sandalwood and something sharper, the acidic tang of oak gall ink and the faint, dusty ghost of old parchment. This is where the Greeks, the Persians, and the Indians are being invited to stay, stripped of their original languages and redressed in the flowing, rhythmic script of Arabic. You find yourself standing before a row of shelves that seem to groan under the weight of their own importance. These aren't and oppose. T the light, breezy sheets of the paper room. These are the heavy hitters. You run your fingers along the spines of the leather-bound volumes. They feel warm, almost like they have a pulse. You stop at a shelf labeled with a script you vaguely recognize as Syriac, then move your hand to the next, where the labels transition into the elegant curves of the Arabic alphabet. You are looking at the translated spirits of Aristotle and Plato. In the 9th century, Aristotle ISN and oppose. T just a name on a syllabus you ignored in college. He is, and quote, the first teacher, and quote, he's the guy everyone wants to sit next to at the cosmic lunch table, even though his prose is about as exciting as watching paint dry in a humid climate. The mainstream historical fact that anchors this room is the sheer scale of the Greco-Arabic translation movement. Between the 8th and 10th centuries, nearly every non-literary Greek secular text that was available in the Middle East was translated into Arabic. We're talking about mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and medicine. Without the guys working in this very room, the Renaissance might have just been a few people in Europe sitting around in the dark wondering why their sundials didn't and oppose. T work and why everything hurt. The Abbasids didn't and oppose. T just save Western civilization's homework. They did the extra credit and illustrated the margins. 2. You pull a volume slightly from the shelf, a translation of Aristotle's Metaphysics. It's heavy, and as you open it, a tiny cloud of dust erupts, dancing in the amber light of a distant oil lamp. You probably won and oppose. T survived the sheer density of this text. Reading Aristotle in the 9th century is like trying to eat a dry bagel while running a marathon. It's a workout for the soul. But there's something beautiful about the way the Greek concepts have been stretched and molded to fit into Arabic. You see terms for and quote, substance and quote, and quote, accident and quote, that had to be invented on the fly by scholars who were essentially linguistic pioneers. It's like watching a master carpenter build a palace using only a pocket knife and a very determined attitude. As you flip through the pages, you notice something strange in the margins. Here is a quirky, fringe tidbit for you. Many of these translators, like the legendary Hunayn ibn Ishaq, were so dedicated to their craft that they developed a sort of, brain-boosting, diet. There are accounts of scholars consuming large quantities of specific honey-based syrups and, clarified, butter to keep their minds sharp during 16-hour translation marathons. Some even believed that smelling certain heavy floral perfumes while working would prevent the, brain fatigue, that comes from staring at Greek syntax for too long. Imagine a modern office where, instead of coffee, everyone is just aggressively huffing jasmine and eating sticks of butter to get through a spreadsheet. It's a vibe, certainly, but your cholesterol probably wooden and oppos. Thank you for it. The room is silent, yet it feels crowded with voices. You move past a section dedicated to Neoplatonism. Historians still argue whether the scholars of the House of Wisdom were genuinely trying to reconcile Greek philosophy with Islamic theology, or if they were just collecting these, pagan, texts as a sort of intellectual status symbol to show the Byzantine Empire that Baghdad was the new boss in town. Some scholars think it was a pure, reason versus faith, showdown, while others argue it was just a very expensive, state-funded hobby for a few bored princes. Either way, the result is the same. A library that contains the blueprints for how to think. You lean against a cedar shelf, the wood cool against your back. To your right, there's a small desk where a translator has left his tools. A reed pen rests on a piece of scrap paper. You pick up the pen. It's light, balanced, and smells faintly of the marshlands where it was harvested. You imagine the frustration of a 9th century translator. Imagine trying to explain the concept of, democracy, or, syllogism, to a world that has entirely different social structures. It's not just about swapping words. It's about swapping worlds. It's the ultimate, lost in translation, scenario, only instead of a misunderstanding at a Tokyo hotel, it's a misunderstanding that could change the course of human logic for the next millennium. No pressure, right? You notice a small ink stain on the floor. A dark, permanent blotch that looks like a miniature map of an unknown island. You find yourself staring at it, wondering which philosopher's work was so exciting that it caused a scholar to knock over his inkwell. Was it a particularly spicy passage of Plato's Republic? Or maybe just a sneeze at a very inopportune moment? In this quiet, dusty bureau, an ink spill is a monumental drama. It's a physical scar on the history of thought. You find yourself wanting to apologize to the floor on behalf of the clumsy genius who lived here 1,200 years ago. The shadows are deepening as the sun moves outside. The rows of books seem to pull the darkness into themselves, their leather covers absorbing the light until they look like solid blocks of shadow. You feel a strange sense of companionship here. You're surrounded by the, greats, but they aren't in oppos. Tea on pedestals. They're on shelves, tucked in with blankets of dust and the smell of sandalwood. They feel accessible. You could reach out and touch the mind of a man who lived in Athens 14 centuries before you, and all it would cost you is a bit of dust on your fingertips and a slight headache from trying to remember what a, categorical imperative, is. You decide to leave the book on the shelf, sliding it back into its slot with a soft, muffled thump. The sound echoes briefly, then is swallowed by the silence. You're starting to feel the weight of the, boring history, Now, it's a good weight. It's the weight of 1,000 years of people trying to figure out why we're here and how things work. It's the weight of a world where the most important thing you could do with your life was make sure a dead Greek guy's thoughts didn't oppos. Disappear into the ether. You take a slow, deep breath of that sandalwood-tinted air, feeling your pulse settle into the slow, steady rhythm of the archives. You aren't and oppos, in a rush. The philosophy ISN and oppos, going anywhere. It's been waiting for 1,000 years. It can wait another few minutes while you just stand there and listen to the silence. You leave the hushed, heavy stillness of the philosophy shelves behind and follow the sound of a rhythmic, collective whispering. It isn't the sound of voices, but the sound of labor, a soft, dry scritch-hiss-scritch that fills the air of this long, sun-drenched gallery. This is the scriptorium, the delivery room of the Golden Age. Here, the abstract ideas you just encountered in the translation bureau are being given physical form, anchored to the page by rows of men whose concentration is so absolute it feels like a physical force. You probably won and oppose. T survived the sheer, agonizing patience required to sit in this room for 10 minutes, let alone 10 hours. If you think waiting for a large file to download is a test of your soul, imagine being the human version of a 9th century inkjet printer, only without the helpful and quote, low ink and quote, warning or the ability to occasionally jam just for the drama of it. You walk slowly down the center aisle, your shadow passing over low, slanted wooden desks called rawl. At each desk sits a scribe, perched on a thick, woven cushion. They don and oppose. T-use chairs. They sit with one knee tucked under them, creating a stable, human tripod. You watch one scribe in particular. He is young, with ink-stained cuticles and a focused squint that suggests he hasn't and oppose. He's seen the horizon in several weeks. He holds a callum, a pen carved from a dried reed, with the kind of reverence you might reserve for a holy relic. Every few seconds, he dips the nib into a small glass well filled with silk fibers soaked in black ink. The silk prevents the pen from taking up too much liquid at once. It's a low-tech and quote, overflow and quote, protection system that works surprisingly well, unlike most of the software updates you've had to deal with recently. The mainstream historical fact that governs this room is the incredible prestige associated with calligraphy in the Abbasid world. It wasn't an oppose, just a clerical job. It was considered a form of spiritual discipline and high art. A master scribe could earn a fortune and move in the highest social circles, essentially becoming the 9th century version of a rock star, but with more stationery and fewer leather pants. The script they are using here is transitioning from the older, blocky Kufic style to the more flowing, rounded Nask script, which was designed to be written faster and read more easily. It's the moment in history when the quote, font and quote, of the world changed to something more user-friendly. You lean closer, careful not to let your robes brush against the wet page. The scribe is working on a copy of a botanical manual. He draws a single character, his hand moving with a fluidity that looks effortless but is actually the result of years of muscle memory. Here is a quirky, fringe tidbit for you. To ensure their ink had the perfect consistency and a subtle, pleasant aroma, some high-end scribes mixed their soot-based pigments with a cocktail of odd ingredients, including honey, gum arabic, and even a dash of musk or saffron. This meant that a particularly expensive book didn't and oppose. Tea just contained knowledge. It literally smelled like a luxury spa. Imagine opening a textbook today and having it smell like a fresh summer breeze instead of old glue and disappointment. It's a level of, quote, user experience, quote, we've sadly lost in the digital age. The air in the scriptorium is warmer than in the corridors, heated by the sunlight streaming through the arched windows and the collective body heat of 50 focused men. There is no, quote, backspace, quote, here. There is no, quote, undo, quote, button. If a scribe makes a mistake 50 pages into a masterpiece, he has to very carefully scrape the ink off the paper with a sharp knife, or in the worst-case scenario, start the entire sheet over. You can see the tension in their shoulders, the universal sign of someone who is one spilled coffee away from a total existential crisis. Though, of course, coffee one and oppose, TBA, quote, thing, quote, in Baghdad for another few centuries, so they're probably just one spilled cup of mint tea away from disaster. Historians still argue whether the House of Wisdom functioned as a true, quote, mass production, quote, center with hundreds of scribes working in a factory-like assembly line, or if it was a more boutique operation where only a few elite masters produced work for the caliph's private collection. Some suggest that the, quote, great library, quote, was more of a legend fueled by later historians, while others point to the sheer volume of manuscripts that survived long enough to reach Europe as proof of a massive, industrial-scale scriptorium. As you stand here watching the endless flicker of reed pens, the, quote, factory, quote, theory feels a lot more plausible. It feels like a beehive, quiet but buzzing with the frantic energy of creation. You notice a scribe at the end of the row who is performing the nib-cutting ritual. He uses a small, incredibly sharp knife to prune the tip of his reed pen at a very specific angle. The angle of the cut determines the slant of the script, and every scribe has a preferred obliqueness that is as unique as a fingerprint. He tests the cut on a scrap piece of paper, nodding to himself. It's a moment of quiet, professional satisfaction. You find yourself envying him. In your world, your tools are mostly plastic rectangles that require charging cables. His tools are literal pieces of the earth, reeds, soot, and water. There's a groundedness to it that makes the silence of the room feel even deeper. You continue your walk, noticing the way the scribes stretch during their rare breaks. They roll their necks and crack their knuckles, the 9th century version of carpal tunnel syndrome clearly making itself known. You feel a sudden urge to offer them an ergonomic keyboard or at least a decent chair, but then you realize they probably have better posture than you do, hunched over your glowing screen in the dark. Their focus is a form of meditation. They aren't in oppos. Just copying words. They are immortalizing them. They are the bridge between a dying Greek philosopher and a student who won in oppos. Be born for another 800 years. The sound of the pens is starting to act as a rhythmic sedative. Scritch, dip, hush, scritch. It's a heartbeat. You find your own pace slowing down to match it. You aren't in oppos. A guest anymore. You're just part of the atmosphere, like the dust motes or the scent of saffron ink. You see a master scribe at the head of the room checking the work of the younger apprentices. He doesn't in oppos. Say a word. He just points to a slightly crooked aleph with a long, thin stick. The apprentice bows his head and begins the slow process of correction. It's a world of absolute standards. There is no good enough in the house of wisdom. There is only perfect or do it again. As you reach the far end of the gallery, you look back at the rows of bent backs and moving hands. They are building a world, one character at a time, and they are doing it in total silence. It's a reminder that the most revolutionary things in history often happen without any noise at all. You turn toward the next archway, the scritch hiss of the pens following you like a gentle, papery tide, pulling you further into the quiet heart of the Golden Age. You're starting to feel a bit heavy-lidded yourself, the repetitive motion of the scriptorium having successfully unspooled the last of your modern anxieties. You emerge from the rhythmic scratching of the scriptorium into a circular chamber that feels as though it is reaching upward toward the heavens. The ceiling is a high, vaulted dome, and the air here is cooler, carrying the faint, metallic scent of polished brass and the ozone-rich stillness of an approaching night. This is the astronomical niche, a sanctuary for those who looked at the desert sky and decided that, pretty lights wasn't and oppos, a satisfying enough explanation. In the center of the room, resting on velvet-draped pedestals, are the tools of the astrolabists, intricate, multi-layered discs of brass and silver that look like clockwork puzzles designed by an obsessive-compulsive deity. You approach one of these instruments, leaning in until your nose almost touches the cold metal. It's an astrolabe, the smartphone of the 9th century, capable of telling the time, finding the direction of Mecca, and predicting the rise of the stars, all without needing a single software update or a cracked screen. The engravings are so fine they look like spiderwebs frozen in gold. You probably won in oppos. Survived the math required to actually operate one of these things. It involves spherical trigonometry that would make a modern calculus professor weep into their morning coffee. But here, in the House of Wisdom, this ISN and oppos, just math. It's a map of the universe that you can hold in the palm of your hand. The mainstream historical fact that anchors this room is the Abbasid obsession with the Almagest, Ptolemy's definitive guide to the stars. The scholars here didn't in oppos. Just translate it. They corrected it. They built massive observatories in Baghdad and Damascus, using giant quadrants to measure the tilt of the Earth's axis with an accuracy that wouldn't in oppos be surpassed for centuries. They were the first to realize that the stars weren't and oppos. Just fixed points on a blanket, but a dynamic, moving system. It's the moment humanity stopped just staring at the sky and started taking notes. You trace the edge of a celestial globe, a bronze sphere engraved with the constellations. Here is a quirky, fringe tidbit for you. Many of the star names we use today, like Aldebaran and Betelgeuse, are direct transliterations of the Arabic names given to them by the scholars in this very building. But more interestingly, some of the most advanced astronomical tables of the era were funded by astrologers who were trying to predict the caliph's mood swings. The "hard science" of the stars was often subsidized by the "soft science" of trying to figure out if next Tuesday was a good day to ask for a raise. It's a comforting thought that even the greatest scientific leaps in history were partly fueled by someone's boss being a bit of a nightmare. The room is bathed in a soft, bluish light from the high windows, making the brass instruments glow with an ethereal, ghostly sheen. Historians still argue whether the Islamic Moraga revolution in astronomy, which eventually provided the mathematical models Copernicus used to put the sun at the center of the solar system, actually began right here in the 9th century, or if those breakthroughs came a bit later. Some argue that the House of Wisdom scholars were, mere preservers, of Greek thought, while others point to the subtle, revolutionary tweaks in their star charts as proof that they were already dismantling the old geocentric world, 1 degree at a time. You find a scroll nearby, unrolled on a marble table. It's a map of the moon, or at least what they could see of it through the early, primitive sighting tubes they used before telescopes were a thing. The ink is a deep, shimmering indigo, and the craters are marked with tiny, precise circles. You imagine a scholar standing on the roof of this very building, shivering in the desert night air, squinting at a distant silver orb and trying to make sense of the shadows. There's a profound loneliness to the work, a quiet dignity in being the only person awake in a city of 2 million, just to check if Mars is where it's supposed to be. You notice a small, portable astrolabe tucked into a leather case. It's no larger than a pocket watch. You imagine the traveler who owned it, navigating the vast, featureless dunes by following the instruction manual of the sky. In a world without GPS, this piece of brass was the difference between reaching a lush oasis and becoming a permanent, dried-out feature of the landscape. You feel a sudden, sharp appreciation for your own Maps app, even if it does occasionally try to drive you into a lake. These scholars didn't and oppose, have recalculating they only had the stars and their own ability to not mess up a decimal point. The silence in the astronomical niche is different from the silence of the library. It's an outer space kind of silence, vast, cool, and a little bit intimidating. You find yourself whispering, as if speaking too loudly might knock the planets out of their orbits. You look up at the dome, which is painted with a fading mural of the zodiac signs. The paint is peeling slightly in the corners, a reminder that even in the Golden Age, maintenance was a struggle. You find comfort in that small imperfection. It makes the grand pursuit of universal truth feel a bit more human, a bit more grounded. You sit on a low stone ledge, watching the way the light catches the teeth of a brass gear in a nearby mechanical calendar. The rhythmic tick-hush of the city outside is gone, replaced by the internal hum of your own thoughts. You are drifting through the gears of the cosmos. You aren't and oppos, worried about the future or the past. You are just a point of observation in a very large, very well-organized universe. The boring history is doing its job, smoothing out the jagged edges of your day until you feel as polished and balanced as a silver quadrant. As you prepare to move on, you take one last look at the celestial globe. It's a reminder that even when the world below was messy and loud, the scholars of Baghdad found a place where everything followed a perfect, silent logic. You turn away from the stars and head back toward the inner courtyards, the cool metallic scent of the niche lingering in your hair like a memory of a night that never ends. You are deeper into the House of Wisdom now, and the modern world has never felt further away. You step out of the celestial shadows of the observatory wing and find yourself in a transition space that feels less like a building and more like a lung. This is the central courtyard, a perfect rectangle of open sky framed by the jagged geometry of the library's arches. The air here is warmer than the stone corridors but significantly fresher, carrying the scent of damp earth and the citrusy sharpness of lemon trees planted in large, glazed ceramic pots. In the center of the courtyard stands a device that looks like a brass birdcage filled with gears and floating glass bulbs. This is the clepsydra, or the water clock, a masterpiece of 9th century engineering that is currently the only thing making any noise in this entire complex. You walk toward it, your sandals clicking softly on the marble tiles. The sound of the clock is a rhythmic, hypnotic drip-clack hiss. It's a liquid heartbeat, measuring the passage of the golden age in precise, watery increments. You probably won in Oppos. T survived the sheer, agonizing slow-motion drama of watching a water clock. It's the original and quote, loading bar and quote, and it makes a 1% per hour download speed look like a Formula One race. But as you stand there, the steady drip 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 begins to sync with your own pulse. You find yourself waiting for each drop with a strange, sleepy intensity. The mainstream historical fact that makes this courtyard a hub of genius is the work of the Banu Musa brothers, 3 siblings who were essentially the end quote, mythbusters and quote, of the Abbasid era. They wrote the Book of Ingenious Devices, which detailed over 100 automated machines, from self-trimming lamps to fountains that changed their spray patterns based on the time of day. They were obsessed with, and quote, tricking and quote, physics. This water clock ISN and Oppos. T just telling time. It's a demonstration that human beings can take the chaotic flow of nature and force it into a predictable, mechanical rhythm. It's the birth of the machine age, happening in a garden in Iraq while most of the world was still trying to figure out how to keep their roofs from leaking. You lean against a pillar, watching a small brass figurine on the clock face tilt its head every time a new reservoir fills. Here is a quirky, fringe tidbit for you. The Banu Musa were famously competitive, and they reportedly designed some of their mechanical toys specifically to prank their fellow scholars. There are records of, and quote, magic and quote, vessels that would only pour water if the person holding them was, and quote, virtuous and quote, which really just meant they knew where the secret air hole was located on the handle. Imagine being a world-renowned philosopher and being publicly defeated by a trick teapot during a formal dinner. It's a reminder that even the greatest minds of the 9th century Warren and Oppos, T above a little bit of high-tech and quote, gotcha and quote, humor. The courtyard is filled with a soft, diffused light as the sun moves behind a stray desert cloud. Historians still argue whether these advanced mechanical designs were actually built and used on a large scale, or if they were mostly, in quote, paper projects and quote, theoretical exercises meant to show off mathematical prowess. Some scholars believe the House of Wisdom was filled with these humming, clicking robots, while others argue that the maintenance required for a water-powered bird would have been a nightmare even for a caliph's budget. But as you listen to the hiss of the internal siphons, the reality of the machine feels very, very solid. You notice a small, green lizard sunning itself on the edge of the clock's basin. It's perfectly still, its throat pulsing in time with the dripping water. You find yourself entering a similar state of zen. Remember the crocodile dung sunscreen we talked about in another lifetime? Well, here, the only thing you need to protect yourself from is the overwhelming urge to lie down on the cool marble and stay there forever. The courtyard is a, and quote, sensory deprivation tank and quote, designed by architects. The walls are high enough to block the sight of the city, leaving you with nothing but the blue square of the sky and the repetitive, mechanical music of the water. You watch a single drop of water hang from a silver spout. It swells, capturing the entire courtyard in a distorted, spherical reflection, before gravity finally wins and it falls into the basin with a soft plink. It's the most dramatic thing that's happened in the last 10 minutes, and you are here for it. You're starting to realize that boredom is actually a luxury. In the modern world, boredom is something we, and quote, kill and quote, with apps and videos. Here, boredom is a space where your brain finally gets to stop reacting and start simply existing. You are as idle as the lizard, and it feels like a superpower. The water clock triggers a small chime, a thin, silvery and quote, ting and quote, that signals the passing of another hour. It's not a loud, demanding bell. It's a polite suggestion that time is moving on, whether you choose to move with it or not. You think about how different this is from the digital clocks in your world, with their glowing, aggressive numbers that always seem to be shouting at you to be somewhere else. This clock is made of brass and water and gravity. It's a physical part of the earth. You move to the edge of a small reflecting pool nearby. The water is so still it looks like a sheet of dark glass. You see your own reflection, but it looks different, softer, more patient. You spend a long time just watching the way the wind occasionally ripples the surface, turning your face into a series of shimmering, liquid lines. It's better than any filter you've ever used. You feel the cool dampness of the air hitting your skin, a perfect contrast to the dry heat you left at the gates of the city. The Banu Musa would be proud of you. You are currently the most efficient machine in the courtyard, a device for converting silence into peace. You Aran and Apos, T processing data. You Aran and Apos, T solving problems. You are just a biological water clock, breathing in and out, marking the passage of a very long, very quiet afternoon. The Golden Age ISN and Apos, T a series of dates and battles. It's this specific feeling of having enough time to watch a lizard and a brass bird. As you prepare to leave the courtyard and head back into the shaded depths of the library, you take one last look at the clepsydra. The brass gears continue their slow, invisible dance. The water continues its steady, gravitational journey. You realize that you've been standing here for an hour, and yet, for the first time in years, you don an Apos. Feel like you've, wasted, a single second. You turn toward the archway leading to the medical wing, the drip clack of the clock fading behind you, leaving only the soft, floral scent of the lemon trees in your wake. You leave the rhythmic dripping of the courtyard and step into a wing where the air smells distinctly of a 9th century apothecary. A cooling, medicinal haze of crushed mint, dried rose petals, and the sharp, camphoraceous bite of myrrh. This is the medical wing, the silent laboratory where the works of Galen and Hippocrates are being dissected, debated, and occasionally corrected by men who Aran and Apos. Afraid to look under the hood of the human machine. The light here is softer, filtered through high, dusty clear-story windows, illuminating rows of shelves packed with thick, indigo-dyed scrolls. You probably won an Apos. Survived the sight of some of these early surgical diagrams. They feature eye-couching needles and bone saws that look suspiciously like gardening tools, reminding you that, healthcare, in the 800s required a very high pain threshold and a lot of luck. You approach a low table where a massive volume lies open. It's a copy of the Kitab al-Tasrif, an early medical encyclopedia. You run your fingers along the edge of the thick paper, feeling the slight indentation where the scribe pressed his pen into the fibers. The mainstream historical fact that anchors this room is the sheer sophistication of Abbasid medicine, which far outpaced anything happening in Europe at the time. Baghdad was home to the world's first true hospitals, called Bimaristans, which featured separate wards for different diseases, pharmacies, and even a form of medical school where students had to pass exams to practice. It's the moment in history when, doctoring, moved from being a superstitious hobby to a rigorous, evidence-based profession. You lean in to examine an anatomical sketch of the human eye. The detail is staggering. Every nerve and vessel is rendered in fine, charcoal-colored ink. Here is a quirky, fringe tidbit for you. Many of the early pharmacological, recipes, in these scrolls Warren and Apos, just about chemistry, they were about flavor. Scholars like Al-Razi believed that a patient was more likely to recover if their medicine didn't and Apos. Tea tastes like swamp water, so they pioneered the use of syrups, fruit preserves, and honey coating for pills. You are literally standing in the birthplace of the spoonful of sugar approach to medicine. If you were a patient here, you might be prescribed a tonic of violet water and crushed pearls, which sounds more like a high-end cocktail than a cure for a headache. But honestly, it's a lot more relaxing than a modern ibuprofen. The room is quiet, the only sound being the distant, muffled thump of a mortar and pestle from the pharmacy downstairs. Historians still argue whether these early scholars truly understood the concept of, contagion, or if they were still operating entirely on the Greek theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Some scholars point to the writings of Ibn Sina, who suggested that diseases could be spread by, tiny invisible bodies, in the air and water, essentially predicting germ theory 1,000 years early. Others argue this was just a lucky poetic guess. Regardless, as you stand among these scrolls, the end quote, humors and quote, theory feels strangely logical. You feel a bit and quote, phlegmatic and quote, yourself, slow, cool, and ready for a very long nap. You notice a small glass jar on a nearby shelf containing a dark, resinous substance. It's labeled in a cramped, hurried hand, end quote, opium for the numbing of the limbs, end quote. Remember that, end quote, crocodile dung sunscreen, end quote, we discussed? Well, the medical wing has its own version of questionable ingredients, including recipes that call for the ground-up horns of a unicorn, which was usually just a very confused narwhal, to cure poisoning. It's a reminder that even the Golden Age had its, end quote, Dr. Google, end quote, moments of total misinformation. You find comfort in the fact that humanity has always been a little bit gullible, provided the packaging looks professional enough. You move to a section of the wall where several surgical instruments are displayed on a silk cloth. They are made of fine Damascus steel, polished until they catch the dim light like shards of silver. There are forceps, scalpels, and a terrifying-looking device used for removing cataracts. You find yourself backing away slowly. You aren't in Apos. Here for a checkup. You're here for the quiet. You find a stool in the corner and sit down, letting the medicinal scent of the room wash over you. It's end quote, clean end quote, smell, devoid of the city's sweat and smoke. It's the smell of hope, or at least the 9th century version of it. You imagine a scholar sitting here, late at night, trying to figure out why a heart beats or why a wound festers. There were no x-rays, no stethoscopes, just their own eyes and the heavy, translated weight of Greek wisdom. There's a certain bravery in it, poking around in the dark of human biology with nothing but a reed pen and a very sharp knife. You feel a sudden surge of gratitude for your modern antibiotics, but you also feel a strange kinship with these ancient doctors. They were just trying to fix things. They were trying to make the world hurt a little less, one rosewater tonic at a time. The shadows are beginning to stretch across the floor, turning the indigo scrolls into dark, vertical bars. You watch a moth flutter near a small oil lamp on a scholar's desk. Its wings make a tiny, frantic pap-pap-pap sound against the glass. It's the only sign of struggle in the entire wing. Everything else is perfectly still. You find your own breathing becoming rhythmic and shallow, matching the heavy, sedated atmosphere of the archives. You are drifting through a forest of cures, surrounded by the collective medical anxiety of an entire civilization that has been successfully soothed by the passage of time. You notice a bowl of dried lavender on the table next to you. You pick up a pinch and crush it between your fingers, releasing a fresh wave of scent that cuts through the heavier musk of the resins. It's a bright, floral note in a very serious room. You realize that the end quote, boring history end quote, of medicine is actually quite beautiful when you are in Anapos. The one being operated on. It's a story of curiosity overcoming fear. You are just a passenger on this journey, and for now, the only end quote, procedure end quote, you need is to stay exactly where you are and let the silence heal your modern, frazzled nerves. As you stand up to leave, your legs feel heavy, as if you've spent the last hour in a very comfortable waiting room. You take one last look at the anatomical sketches, the ink-drawn eyes staring back at you with ancient, silent intelligence. You turn toward the doorway that leads to the mathematical alcoves, the scent of rose water and camphor clinging to your robes like a protective charm. You are moving deeper into the logic of the past, and the chaotic world of the present is starting to feel like a disease you've successfully recovered from. You step away from the medicinal haze of the apothecary wing and move into a narrow, stone-lined corridor where the silence is of a different quality. It isn't the empty silence of a hallway or the rhythmic silence of the scriptorium. It is a dense, vibrating quiet, like the air right before a thunderstorm. You have reached the heart of the dialectics chamber, the place where the muffled echoes of intense scholarly translation debates still seem to bounce off the vaulted ceiling. Here, the air doesn't smell like herbs or ink. It smells like old stone and the faint, dry scent of parchment that has been handled by too many sweaty palms. You probably won and oppose. Survived the sheer, pedantic intensity of these arguments. We are talking about men who would spend 3 weeks debating the philosophical implications of a single Greek preposition until someone finally lost their temper and threw a shoe. You find a small, recessed stone bench and sit, leaning your head against the cool masonry. The mainstream historical fact that fuels the tension in this room is the Mina, a period of, Inquisition, where scholars were forced to align with the Mu and Apos, Tazilite school of thought, which championed human reason and the createdness of the Kur and Apos, and it was a time when your private philosophical leanings could suddenly become a very public, very dangerous problem. Imagine if your Twitter hot takes on metaphysics could get you exiled or thrown into a 9th century dungeon. It's a sobering thought that makes the quiet of the library feel a lot more fragile, like a glass vase perched on the edge of a very high shelf. As you sit there, you can almost hear the ghostly whispers of the House of Wisdom, heavyweights, men like Al-Kindi, the philosopher of the Arabs, he was the one who argued that you didn't Apos. Need to be Greek to understand the truth, which was a pretty bold stance in a room full of Hellenistic fanboys. Here is a quirky, fringe tidbit for you. These scholarly debates were often so heated that the caliph's court had to employ moderators who were essentially high-stakes librarians armed with the power to cut off a scholar's stipend if they became too rude. There are accounts of philosophers getting into insult wars where they would write entire books just to call their rival a dim-witted goat-herder in the most elegant rhythmic Arabic prose imaginable. It's the original diss track only with more syllogisms and fewer bass drops. The corridor is dim, illuminated only by the occasional flickering oil lamp set into a wall niche. Historians still argue whether these intense debates between the traditionalists and the rationalists were a sign of a healthy, vibrant democracy of ideas or a symptom of a deeply fractured society that was one bad argument away from a civil war. Some suggest the House of Wisdom was a peaceful utopia of shared knowledge, while others see it as a high-pressure cooker where different cultures and religions were forced to clash under the watchful eye of the state. But as you sit in the shadows, the clash feels distant. All that remains is the weight of the questions themselves, the big, heavy ones about the nature of God, the limits of the human mind, and whether or not the universe has an on switch. You notice a small, discarded scrap of paper near your feet, likely a cheat sheet dropped by a student 1,000 years ago. It's covered in tiny, cramped handwriting, notes on the difference between essence and existence, You pick it up, the paper feeling thin and brittle like a dried leaf. Remember that, crocodile dung sunscreen, from earlier? Well, compared to the intellectual sunburn these scholars were trying to avoid, a little bit of reptile waste seems like a simple fix. These men were trying to build a shield of logic to protect the world from chaos. But as you flip the scrap of paper over, you see someone has just doodled a very small, very bored-looking camel in the corner. Even in the middle of a world-changing debate, someone was just waiting for the bell to ring so they could go get some lentils. The stillness of the room is almost hypnotic. You find yourself staring at the way the lamplight creates dancing shadows on the underside of the arches. They look like giants whispering secrets. You're starting to feel that, sleepy YouTube host, energy taking over, your eyelids drooping in time with the flickering flame. You are in Apos. Worried about being right or wrong anymore. In the grand scheme of the 9th century, most of these debates ended in a stalemate anyway. The world kept turning, the stars kept moving according to the astrolabes, and the scholars eventually went home to sleep. You imagine the scene. 2 men in heavy wool robes, faces flushed with the effort of being logical while a servant in the background quietly sweeps up the dust they've kicked up. There's a comedy to it, the sheer human stubbornness of wanting to name the unnameable. You feel a strange sense of relief that you don and Apos have to participate. You are just an observer, a ghost in the hallway, listening to the silence of resolved arguments. The boring history has reached its peak here. It's the history of people talking until they ran out of words. The air in the corridor is getting cooler as the desert night begins to press against the outer walls of the library. You take a slow, deep breath, feeling the tension in your shoulders dissolve into the stone behind you. You Aran and Apos, TA scholar. You Aran and Apos, TA translator. You are just a person sitting on a bench in Baghdad 12 centuries after the fact, and that is more than enough. The silence ISN and Apos, T avoid. It's a conversation that has finally reached a comfortable pause. You stand up, your robes rustling with a sound like dry leaves. The scrap of paper slips from your fingers and drifts back to the floor, returning to its spot in the dust. You turn toward the light at the end of the passage, heading toward the mathematics alcove. The muffled echoes of the debates fade away, replaced by the internal, silent rhythm of numbers. You are moving from the world of maybe into the world of certainty and the transition feels as smooth as silk. You drift out of the corridor of debates and into a smaller, more intimate space that feels remarkably crisp. This is the mathematics alcove, a semicircular room where the very air seems to have been organized into a grid. There are no heavy tapestries here to muffle the sound, and the light from the high, desert sun hits the white-plastered walls with a clinical, unforgiving brightness. On a low table in the center of the room sits a shallow wooden tray filled with fine, leveled sand. A toct. You probably won an Apos. T survived the transition from your comfortable, calculator-reliant existence to the raw, mental gymnastics of 9th century algebra. It's the kind of place where, showing your work, involves a stick, a pile of dust, and a level of concentration that would make a chess grandmaster look like they're just daydreaming. You walk over to the sand tray. A scholar has left a series of symbols traced into the surface. They are in Apos. T the Roman numerals you might expect. Those clunky, prehistoric X S and V and S that make long division feel like a construction project. Instead, you see the elegant, efficient ancestors of the numbers you use today. The mainstream historical fact that makes this alcove the most important room in the building is the work of Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi. He was the man who essentially, imported, the decimal system and the concept of zero from India and repackaged them for the Western world. He wrote the Kitab al-Jabr, the book from which we get the word, algebra, He didn't just solve equations. He invented a systematic way to think about the unknown. You look at a small circle drawn in the sand, the cipher or zero. It looks so simple, so empty, and yet it is the most powerful thing in the room. Here is a quirky, fringe tidbit for you. Before zero was widely accepted, some scholars were genuinely suspicious of it, viewing it as a, devilish, or, occult, concept because it represented, nothing, while simultaneously being, something, It's the 9th century version of a glitch in the Matrix. Imagine trying to explain to a skeptical merchant that he needs to use a symbol for, not having any camels, in order to more efficiently count his actual camels. It's a hard sell, but in this alcove, that, nothing, is the foundation of everything. The room is silent, save for the dry, microscopic sound of a few grains of sand shifting in the tray. Historians still argue whether al-Khwarizmi's, algorithms, a word derived from his own name, were intended for pure scientific discovery, or if he was simply trying to solve the very practical, very messy legal problems of Islamic inheritance law. Some argue that algebra was born out of the need to divide a deceased merchant's estate between 3 wives, 4 sons, and a very confused cousin without starting a small war. It's a beautiful thought, that the math powering your modern computer was originally developed to keep 9th century family dinners from turning into a legal nightmare. You notice a small brass ruler resting on the edge of the table. It's notched with precise measurements, each line a testament to the Abbasid love for, exactness, remember that, crocodile dung sunscreen, we discussed? Well, while the biologists were playing with swamp ingredients, the mathematicians were busy proving that the universe followed a set of rigid, unbreakable rules. You find yourself tracing the lines of the ruler with your eyes, feeling the jagged edges of your own thoughts being smoothed out by the logic of the room. Numbers Don and Apos. T have opinions. Numbers Don and Apos. Tea get into and quote, insult wars and quote, like the philosophers in the next room. They just are. You sit on a low stool, watching the way the shadows of the window grate create a perfect geometric pattern on the floor. You've reached a point in your journey where the in quote, boring history and quote, has become a warm, weightless blanket. You are in an oppos, tea processing and quote, information and quote, anymore. You are just absorbing a frequency. The frequency of the alcove is a steady, low-volume hum. You imagine Al-Khwarizmi sitting exactly where you are, staring at the sand, realizing that you can move a negative quantity to the other side of an equation by and quote, restoring and quote, it the literal meaning of algebra. It's a moment of pure, quiet and quote, aha, and quote. That changed the world while the rest of Baghdad was probably just worrying about the price of dates. You pick up a small wooden stylus from the table. It's smooth from years of use, smelling faintly of old wood and the sweat of many hands. You don an oppos, tea write anything. You just hold it, feeling the balance of it. You feel like a ghost in a laboratory of the mind. You realize that your modern world, with its flight paths, its stock markets, and its encryption, is all just an extension of this quiet, sandy room. You are standing at the source code of reality. It's a bit overwhelming, so you decide to just focus on the sand again. The sun is beginning to dip, and the bright white of the walls is turning to a soft, bruised purple. You watch a single grain of sand roll down the side of a traced and quote, for, and quote. It's a very slow descent. You follow it with the intensity of someone watching a blockbuster movie. This is what the House of Wisdom does to you. It stretches time until a rolling grain of sand is a headline event. You feel your heart rate drop into a deep, rhythmic crawl. You are, and quote, rounding down and quote, to the nearest whole number. You find yourself thinking about the, and quote, algorithm and quote, of your own life, the repetitive, predictable things you do every day. Here, in the 9th century, that word feels less like a corporate secret and more like a gentle mathematical hug. Everything has its place. Everything balances out. You don an oppos. T need to solve for X tonight. You just need to be the cipher, the zero, the quiet space where the math stops for a while. As you stand up, you are careful not to bump the table. You want the sand to stay exactly as it is, a snapshot of a thought from 1,000 years ago. You turn toward the exit, heading for the librarian's private quarters where the tea is brewing. The logic of the alcove stays with you. A clean, sharp clarity that makes the deepening shadows of the library feel safe and ordered. You are moving away from the numbers now, but you know they'll be there when you wake up, holding the world together with their silent, invisible hands. You step out of the sharp, geometric clarity of the mathematics alcove and follow a soft, amber light toward a heavy silk curtain. As you pull it aside, the air changes once more. This time, it is warm, fragrant, and carries the low, musical murmur of a silver samovar. You have entered the private sanctum of the master librarians. The walls here are lined not with cold stone, but with shelves of dark, polished mahogany, holding the most precious, silk-bound manuscripts in the entire caliphate. The floor is covered in thick, plush Persian rugs that swallow the sound of your footsteps entirely. You probably won and oppos. Tea survived the sheer, overwhelming coziness of this room. It is a direct assault on your productivity. This is where the keepers of the world's secrets come to exhale, and you are invited to join them on a low, silk-covered divan. A librarian, his beard as white and soft as unspun wool, gestures for you to sit. He doesn't and oppos. Tea say a word, but the way he pours the mint tea, from a height, creating a perfect, frothy head in a glass rimmed with gold, is a language in itself. The mainstream historical fact about these men is that they weren't and oppos. Tea just and quote, book organizers and quote, the Sahib al-Bayt, master of the house, was often one of the most powerful political figures in the empire, acting as a personal advisor to the caliph. They were the gatekeepers of truth, deciding which Greek texts were worth the gold and which were better left in the dust of Byzantium. To be a librarian in 9th century Baghdad was to hold the keys to the future of human thought. You take the tea, the glass warming your palms. The scent of fresh mint and honey is so potent it feels like it's clearing the very back of your mind. Here is a quirky, fringe tidbit for you. These elite librarians were so protective of their collections that they reportedly used, and quote, book curses, and quote, written on the final pages of manuscripts. These Warren and Oppos, T just polite, and quote, please return, and quote, notes. They were elaborate warnings invoking the wrath of the heavens on anyone who dared to spill tea on the pages or, heaven forbid, and quote, borrow, and quote, a book indefinitely. You are currently drinking tea in a room where a single clumsy gesture could theoretically result in 1,000 years of spiritual bad luck. It certainly makes you hold the glass a bit more carefully. The room is bathed in the soft, flickering glow of oil lamps fueled by expensive, unscented oils. Historians still argue whether the librarians of the House of Wisdom were actually the, end quote, first scientists, end quote, in their own right, or if they were essentially high-level bureaucrats who just happened to be very good at filing. Some evidence suggests they conducted their own experiments in the courtyards at night, testing the chemical properties of the inks and papers they commissioned. Others argue they were too busy managing the massive egos of the translators to ever get any real work done themselves. You watch the old man across from you. He looks like he hasn't been, end quote, busy, end quote, in about 40 years, and yet you get the feeling he knows exactly where every single comma in the library is located. You notice a small, exquisitely carved wooden box on the table between you. It contains, end quote, finger protectors, end quote, made of thin, polished bone, tools used to turn the pages of the most fragile manuscripts without leaving oils from the skin. Remember that, end quote, crocodile dung sunscreen, end quote? Well, these librarians were far more concerned with preserving the skin of their books than their own. You find yourself looking at your own hands, suddenly feeling like a clumsy giant in a shop of fine glass. The, end quote, boring history, end quote, has slowed your movements down to a crawl. You are in an Oppos, tea reaching for your tea. You are, end quote, embarking on a journey, end quote, toward the tea. The librarian finally speaks, but his voice is so low and gravelly it sounds like the rustle of old parchment. He tells a joke, or at least you think it's a joke. It involves a mathematician, a poet, and a very confused donkey trying to calculate the circumference of a date pit. You find yourself laughing, not because you understand the punchline, but because the sound of human laughter in this cathedral of silence is unexpectedly delightful. It's a reminder that these Warren and Oppos, T just, end quote, figures in a textbook, end quote, they were people who got tired, who liked their tea sweet, and who found math jokes funny after 12 hours of work. You lean back into the cushions, watching the steam rise from your glass in long, lazy spirals. You've reached a state of relaxation that is almost spiritual. The modern world, with its, end quote, urgent, end quote, emails and its, end quote, breaking, end quote, news, feels like a noisy, distant playground that you've finally been allowed to leave. In this room, the only thing that is urgent is the cooling of your tea. The only thing that is breaking is the seal on a new box of saffron. You feel your heart rate settle into a deep, steady rhythm, matching the slow, rhythmic breathing of the old man across from you. You imagine the countless nights this room has seen, the secret meetings where the fate of a Greek manuscript was decided over a bowl of dried figs, the quiet moments of triumph when a difficult passage of Aristotle was finally cracked. This room is the, end quote, backstage, end quote, of history. It's where the golden age put its feet up and took off its boots. You find yourself closing your eyes for a moment, letting the scent of the sandalwood incense and the warmth of the tea wrap around you like a heavy, velvet cloak. You are in an Oppos, TA guest. You're an apprentice of the stillness. The silence here is the most expensive thing in Baghdad. It's a silence bought with the wealth of empires and the labor of thousands of scribes. It is a thick, rich silence that you can almost taste. You realize that you are in an Oppos, T-board. You are simply, end quote, full, end quote. You are full of the quiet, full of the history, and full of the realization that some of the greatest movements in human history started with a few tired men drinking tea in a dark room. As you finish your tea, the librarian nods to you, a silent acknowledgement that your time in the inner sanctum is coming to an end. You stand up, feeling the weight of the rugs beneath your feet, and prepare to head back out into the long, starlit corridors of the geography wing. You leave the warmth and the minty steam behind, but you carry the librarian's calm with you. You are moving through the map of the world now, but your own internal compass is pointing directly toward a very deep, very necessary sleep. You push past the heavy silk curtain of the librarians and oppos, sanctum, and step into a long, echoing gallery that feels like a cold breath of air. This is the geography wing, a hall so vast that the far end is swallowed by a soft, charcoal-colored haze. The scent here is thin and metallic, smelling of old iron and the dry, briny ghost of sea salt that seems to have leached out of the maps themselves. The walls are covered in massive, hand-painted charts, but they don in oppos. T look like the maps on your phone. South is at the top, and the world is a sprawling, ink-stained flower of interconnected trade routes. You probably won in oppos. T survived the sheer navigational vertigo of standing here. It's a world where, in quote, uncharted territory, in quote, ISN and oppos, T a metaphor, but a very real place where people believe the water literally boiled if you sailed too far. You walk toward a massive wooden globe, its surface covered in layers of polished lacquer. The mainstream historical fact that makes this room a miracle of its time is the work of Al-Khwarizmi. Remember our math genius, who also led a team of 70 geographers to produce the Surat al-Ard, or the, in quote, image of the earth, end quote. They didn't in oppos. T just guess where things were. They used celestial observations and trigonometry to calculate the coordinates of over 2,000 locations. It was the first time humanity tried to pin the world down with numbers instead of just stories about monsters and gold. They even calculated the circumference of the Earth with an error margin of less than 1%, which is frankly embarrassing for anyone in the 21st century who still struggles to find their way out of a multi-story parking garage. You stop in front of a map of the Indian Ocean, the waves rendered in rhythmic, turquoise swirls. Here is a quirky, fringe tidbit for you. Many of the travelers who provided the data for these maps, like the legendary Suleiman al-Tajir, claim to have seen things that would make a modern biologist's head spin. There are serious scholarly accounts in these archives of, in quote, sea monsters, end quote, that were likely just very confused manatees, and descriptions of islands where the trees grew, end quote, loaves of bread, end quote, which was actually just the first Middle Eastern encounter with the jackfruit. You are looking at a world that was still being, end quote, unboxed, end quote, where every merchant returning to Baghdad was treated like a hero who had just returned from the moon. The gallery is silent, save for the faint, ghostly whistling of the wind through the high clear-story windows. Historians still argue whether the famous, end quote, tabula rogeriana, end quote, the most advanced map of the medieval world, was truly a product of the later Sicilian court, or if the heavy lifting was all done right here in the 9th century House of Wisdom. Some scholars believe that by the time you're standing in this hall, the Abbasids already had a more accurate picture of the African coastline than the Europeans would have for another 500 years. It's a strange feeling, standing in the, end quote, dark ages, end quote, and realizing the lights are actually turned up quite high. You notice a small, brass instrument hanging on a peg, a maritime astrolabe. It's thicker and heavier than the ones in the observatory, designed to be used on the deck of a pitching dhow. Remember that, end quote, crocodile dung sunscreen, end quote? Well, out on the open sea, the merchants of the caliphate were more worried about, end quote, scurvy preventing, end quote, syrups made from dried limes and vinegar. You find yourself tracing the route from Basra to Canton with your finger, feeling the vastness of the world beneath your skin. The, end quote, boring history, end quote, of geography is actually a story of extreme patience. It's the history of men sitting on wooden planks for 6 months just to see what was on the other side of a horizon. You sit on a low stone bench beneath a map of the Silk Road. The indigo ink has faded to a soft, dusty denim color. You've reached a point in your walk where your own internal map is starting to blur. You are in oppos, T, end quote, going, end quote, anywhere. You are just a stationary point in a room full of movement. You imagine the caravans, thousands of camels moving in a slow, rhythmic line across the dunes, carrying silk, spices, and, most importantly, more books for this library. The world outside is a giant circulatory system, and Baghdad is the heart, pumping information in and out. The silence in the geography wing is, end quote, panoramic, end quote. It's the kind of silence you find at the top of a mountain or in the middle of a desert. It makes you feel very small, but in a comforting way. You Arin and Apos, T responsible for the world. You Don and Apos, T have to navigate it. You just have to sit here and let the ink-stained coastlines watch over you. You watch a tiny spider crawl across a map of the Caspian Sea. To the spider, that map is the entire world. To you, it's just a piece of old paper. It's all a matter of scale, Isen and Apos. Tiet, you find your breathing slowing down to match the geologic pace of the room. You notice a series of scrolls dedicated to the wonders of the world, They are filled with illustrations of cinnamon birds and gold-digging ants. You smile at the sheer, imaginative confidence of the 9th century. They knew so much about the stars and the math, but they still left room for the impossible. It makes the world feel bigger, doesn't an Apos? Tiet, less solved, You find yourself wanting to stay in this half-mapped world, where there's still a chance of finding a mountain made of magnets or a river that flows backward. The light in the gallery is turning a deep, oceanic blue as the sun sets. The maps on the walls seem to deepen in color, the oceans becoming black and the deserts turning to a warm, glowing amber. You feel like you're drifting on a raft made of parchment. You Arin and Apos, T worried about the time or the distance. You are just a passenger on a very slow, very quiet planet. The boring history has successfully untethered you from your own geography. You don an Apos. T know where your phone is, and for the first time in years you don an Apos. T care. As you stand up to leave, your legs feel light, as if you've been walking on air instead of stone. You turn toward the botanical archives, leaving the sea monsters and the silk roads behind. You carry the vastness of the hall with you, a mental horizon that has been pushed back just a little further. You are moving toward the plants now, toward the quiet, green growth of the earth, and the transition feels as natural as the turning of a tide. You drift out of the vast, oceanic silence of the geography wing and enter a room that feels like a subterranean garden. The air here is noticeably more humid, weighted with the damp, loamy scent of a greenhouse and the sharp, clean fragrance of crushed eucalyptus. This is the Botanical Archives, the quietest corner of the House of Wisdom, where the green world is painstakingly catalogued in ink and pigment. The walls are lined with shallow, wide drawers, and on the central tables lie manuscripts featuring illustrations so vibrant they seem to pulse with a slow, vegetative life. You probably won an Apos. T survived the transition from your high-definition digital photos to these hand-painted scrolls. It's a world where a single leaf might take a week to draw, and zoom involves leaning in until your eyelashes brush the parchment. You walk toward an open volume of the Kitab al-Nabit, or the Book of Plants, by the polymath al-Dinawari. The mainstream historical fact that makes this room a cornerstone of the Golden Age is that al-Dinawari is essentially the father of Arabic botany, In a time when European herbals were often just messy copies of ancient Greek mistakes, he was out in the field, documenting the life cycles of plants from germination to death with the precision of a modern biologist. He described hundreds of species, focusing not just on what they looked like, but on how they interacted with the soil and the wind. It was the moment botany stopped being a subset of, magic, and became a rigorous branch of the earth sciences. You lean over a drawing of a pomegranate tree. Each individual seed is rendered as a tiny, translucent ruby of ink. Here is a quirky, fringe tidbit for you. The scholars in this wing were obsessed with, grafting, experiments, and there are fringe accounts of them trying to create, hybrid, fruits that would grow with pre-flavored centers. They allegedly experimented with injecting rosewater or spice syrups into the stems of young trees, hoping the fruit would absorb the scent. While modern biology tells us that's not exactly how vascular systems work, you have to admire the 9th century ambition of trying to grow a pre-made dessert directly on a branch. It's the ultimate, farm-to-table, shortcut. The room is incredibly still, the only sound being the very faint, dry rustle of paper as the air from a distant courtyard circulates. Historians still argue whether the botanical gardens associated with these archives were purely for scientific study or if they were the, private playgrounds, of the elite, used for breeding rare flowers for the caliph's banquets. Some suggest the House of Wisdom had a massive, hidden experimental farm just outside the city walls where they tested irrigation techniques that would later revolutionize Mediterranean agriculture. As you look at the intricate drawings of irrigation wheels and canals, the scientific farm theory feels undeniably right. These Warren and Appos, just artists. They were engineers of the earth. You notice a small, dried sprig of jasmine pressed between two sheets of protective silk on a scholar and Appos' desk. It has lost its color, turning a delicate, papery brown. But the scent still lingers, a faint, ghostly sweetness that cuts through the smell of the ink. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen Well, in the botanical wing, the focus was on more pleasant skincare, like almond oil salves and cucumber water mists. You find yourself touching the corner of a page, the paper feeling cool and slightly textured. The boring history of plants is the most relaxing of all. It's a history that moves at the speed of growing grass. You sit on a low wooden bench, watching the way the green pigments in a nearby illustration catch the fading light. They used malachite and crushed verdigris to get those deep, forest tones, and they still look as fresh as the day they were applied. You've reached a state of, photosynthesis yourself sitting still and absorbing the quiet energy of the room. You are in an Appos, thinking about your to-do list. You are in an Appos, thinking about the content you're missing. You are just a human being in a room full of trees that can never be chopped down. The silence here is, vegetative, It's a slow, growing silence that feels like it's wrapping roots around your ankles, tethering you to the floor. You imagine the artist who spent his entire life drawing the same species of thistle, trying to capture the exact way the light hits the thorns. There's a profound humility in it. In a world of empires and wars, this man decided that a thistle was the most important thing in the world. You find yourself agreeing with him. In the stillness of the archives, a single leaf is more than enough to fill your mind. You notice a series of scrolls dedicated to, the language of flowers, which was an Appos, just a Victorian trend, but a complex system of symbolic communication used in the Abbasid court. Each plant held a secret meaning, and a bouquet was essentially a coded letter. You wonder what a bouquet of, boring history, would look like. Probably a lot of lavender for sleep, some sage for wisdom, and maybe a very long, very dry piece of papyrus for the footnotes. You smile at the thought, your breathing falling into a deep, steady rhythm that matches the perceived stillness of the painted forests around you. The shadows are growing long now, the deep greens of the botanical scrolls turning into dark, velvety blacks. You feel like you're sitting in a forest at twilight, even though you're in the middle of a brick-and-mortar library. You aren't an Appos, afraid of the dark. The plants have been here for 1,000 years, and they aren't an Appos, going anywhere. You are just a guest in their silent, ink-drawn kingdom. As you stand up to move toward the final corridors, your movements are fluid and heavy. You turn toward the area where the oil lamps are being lit for the evening, leaving the painted gardens behind. You carry the scent of eucalyptus and the memory of the ruby-red pomegranate seeds with you. You are moving toward the end of the day, toward the flicker of the lamps and the ultimate quiet of the night, and you feel as rooted and peaceful as a tree in the caliph's garden. You drift away from the painted gardens and into the long, tapering corridors that mark the library's outer ring. The air here has lost the humid weight of the botanical wing. It is now dry, thin, and carries the faint, toasted scent of flickering olive oil. This is the Hall of the Evening Lamps, the transition space where the day's intellectual fever breaks and the building begins to prepare for its nightly vigil. Tall, slender bronze lamps stand like silent sentinels at every intersection, their small flames casting long, flickering shadows that dance across the high, vaulted ceilings. You probably won and Appos. Survived the sheer, hypnotic pull of these dancing lights. It's the 9th century version of staring into a campfire, a primal rhythm that bypasses your logic and speaks directly to the part of your brain that just wants to curl up and vanish into the dark. You walk slowly, watching a librarian's assistant move from lamp to lamp with a long, burning taper. He moves with a practiced, feline grace, his shadow stretching 20 feet up the wall before shrinking back to his feet as he passes each light. The mainstream historical fact that defines this twilight hour is the sheer logistical nightmare of lighting the House of Wisdom. Before electricity, a library of this size required thousands of liters of oil and a small army of staff just to ensure the scholars didn't and oppose. T accidentally set a priceless Aristotle manuscript on fire while squinting at a footnote. It was a massive, expensive commitment to the idea that knowledge shouldn't and oppose. T stopped just because the sun did. You pause by a lamp, watching the way the oil pooled in the reservoir shimmers like liquid gold. Here is a quirky, fringe tidbit for you. To keep the air from becoming too smoky or, in quote, heavy, and quote, for the delicate lungs of the scholars, the Abbasids often experimented with scented oil additives. They would infuse the lamp oil with frankincense or dried citrus peels, turning the entire library into a giant, slow-burning diffuser. You are currently breathing in the 9th century equivalent of a, and quote, midnight library, and quote, scented candle. It's a heavy, sedative aroma that makes your limbs feel like they've been filled with warm sand. If you were a scholar here, the, end quote, soothing citrus, end quote, was probably the only thing keeping you from a total breakdown after 10 hours of translating Greek geometry. The silence of the evening is deeper than the silence of the afternoon. It's a, end quote, hollow, end quote, silence, amplified by the way the stone walls reflect the tiny, rhythmic pop and hiss of the burning wicks. Historians still argue whether the House of Wisdom remained a bustling hive of activity through the night, or if there was a strict, end quote, curfew, end quote, to preserve the precious oil and the even more precious manuscripts. Some accounts suggest the caliph himself would visit the library at night, wandering the halls in disguise to see which scholars were truly dedicated and which were just napping on the job. You find yourself checking the shadows, half expecting a royal figure in a plain wool cloak to step out and ask you what you think of the latest translation of Euclid. You notice the way the light catches the dust motes, those same dust motes from section 1, now glowing like embers in the lamplight. Remember that, end quote, crocodile dung sunscreen, end quote? Well, in this light, even the idea of the desert sun feels like a distant, impossible myth. You are in a world made of amber and charcoal. You find a high-backed wooden chair, its seat padded with worn, cracked leather, and you sink into it. The wood groans softly under your weight, a friendly, domestic sound that makes you feel like you've finally come home. You've reached the peak of the, end quote, boring history, end quote, experience. You are sitting in a chair in the dark in a library that has an oppose. Tea existed for 700 years and you feel perfectly at peace. The flickering light is doing something strange to your perception of time. Because the shadows are constantly moving, the walls themselves seem to be breathing. You are in and oppose. Tea watching a clock. You are watching the slow consumption of oil. You are measuring your life in wicks and droplets. It's a beautiful, terrifyingly slow way to exist. You realize that in the modern world, we try to kill the night with bright, aggressive LEDs that scream, end quote, stay awake, end quote. Here, the light is a gentle suggestion. It says, end quote, read one more page if you can, but the bed is calling, end quote. You watch the assistant finish his rounds and vanish through a far archway, leaving you alone in the gallery. The only sound is the internal hum of the building, the settling of stone, the cooling of the day's heat, and the faint, distant call of a night bird from the courtyard. You find your chin dipping toward your chest. The, end quote, boring history, end quote, has successfully dismantled your internal defenses. You are no longer a, end quote, consumer of content, end quote. You are just a part of the architecture, a shadow among shadows. You imagine the millions of words resting on the shelves around you, all tucked in for the night, their ink cooling in the darkness. You notice a small brass snuffer resting on a nearby ledge. It's shaped like a bell. You reach out and touch it, the metal cold against your warm skin. You don an oppose to use it. You want the light to last just a little bit longer, a tiny golden bridge between the world of the living and the world of the books. You feel a strange, sleepy gratitude for the anonymous assistants who kept these lamps burning. They Warren and Oppos, the ones translating the philosophy, but they were the ones who made sure the philosophy could be seen. The shadows are winning now, as the oil in the nearest lamp begins to run low. The circle of light on the floor is shrinking, pulling itself back toward the base of the bronze stand. You find yourself leaning toward the warmth, like a moth. You aren't and Oppos. T worried about the dark. In the House of Wisdom, the dark ISN and Oppos. T empty. It's just full of things you've already learned. You take one last, deep breath of the frankincense-tinted air, feeling the muscles in your neck finally give up the fight. As you prepare to stand up for the final walk toward the exit, you feel like you're moving through water. You turn toward the distant glow of the main gate, leaving the hall of the evening lamps behind. You carry the flickering rhythm of the flames in your eyes, a golden pulse that guides you through the thickening gloom. You are moving toward the end of your journey, toward the silver moon of Baghdad and the final, absolute silence of the desert night. You move away from the dying glow of the evening lamps and toward the great arched exit of the House of Wisdom. The transition is profound. The heavy, perfumed air of the interior gives way to the sharp, silver clarity of the Baghdad night. You are standing on the threshold, the dark silhouette of the round city stretching out before you like a sleeping giant. The Tigris River, just beyond the walls, is a ribbon of liquid mercury under a moon so bright it casts soft, charcoal shadows across the limestone pavement. You probably won an Oppos. T survived the sudden realization of how quiet the world can actually be when 2 million people and 100,000 books all decide to hold their breath at once. It's the kind of silence that has a weight to it, a velvety pressure against your eardrums that makes the modern world of sirens and static feel like a frantic, poorly edited dream. You descend the shallow stone steps, your sandals making a final, muted click-clack against the earth. The mainstream historical fact that punctuates this moment is the eventual fate of this sanctuary. In 1258, the Mongol siege would bring an end to the House of Wisdom, with legends claiming the Tigris ran black with the ink of throne manuscripts. But tonight, in the 9th century, that tragedy is centuries away, an impossible ghost. Tonight, the library is at its zenith, a fortress of thought that feels as permanent as the stars. It's a reminder that while empires are fragile, the ideas they harvest, the algebra, the medicine, the maps of the stars are remarkably difficult to kill. They are seeds that have already begun to blow across the borders of the caliphate, destined to sprout in distant, colder lands. You pause by the outer gate, looking back at the dark, hulking shape of the library. Here is a quirky, fringe tidbit for you. Many of the night watchmen in these elite districts were reportedly paid extra to wear soft, felt-soled shoes, not to catch thieves, but to ensure that the intellectual atmosphere was and Oppos, T disturbed by the sound of a patrol. You are standing in perhaps the only city in human history where the government subsidized the sound of tiptoeing. It's a lovely, absurd detail that makes the Golden Age feel less like a marble monument and more like a very considerate neighbor. You find yourself walking softer now, your own movements becoming part of the city and Oppos' nocturnal grace. The desert air is cool, pulling the last of the library's warmth from your skin. Historians still argue whether the Golden Age truly ended with a bang or a whimper, whether it was the Mongol swords or a slow, internal shift toward more traditionalist, less inquisitive thinking that eventually closed the doors of the House of Wisdom. Some argue the spirit of the place simply migrated, moving to Cairo, Cordoba, and eventually the universities of Europe. As you breathe in the scent of the night-blooming jasmine from a nearby garden, the migration theory feels the most natural. Knowledge is like water. You can try to dam it up in one city, but it always finds a way to leak into the rest of the world. You find a low mud brick wall near the river and sit, watching the moonlight dance on the ripples. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen feels like a joke from a different lifetime now. You've moved past the gimmicks and the trivia. You are just a witness to a cycle that has been turning since the first scribe picked up a reed. You feel a deep, heavy tiredness in your bones. Not the exhausted, jagged fatigue of a long day at work, but the smooth, contented sleepiness of a mind that has been fed well. You are, full, of history. Your internal, search bar, has finally gone blank, replaced by the steady, rhythmic pulse of the river. The stars above Baghdad are incredibly bright, unclouded by the light pollution of the future. You recognize them now: Aldebaran, Betelgeuse, the names given to them by the men you just left in the shadows. They feel like friends. You realize that you Arin and Apos, lost in the 9th century. You are exactly where you are supposed to be. The end quote. Boring history and quote has done its work, slowing your heart rate until you are perfectly synchronized with the rotation of the earth. You are a point of light in a circular city, resting in the cradle of the world and Apos' wisdom. You watch a single fishing boat drift silently down the Tigris, its small lantern a flickering orange dot against the blue-black water. The world is moving on, but it's moving slowly. You feel your eyelids becoming impossibly heavy, the weight of 1,000 translated scrolls pressing down on them with a gentle, irresistible force. You Arin and Apos, fighting it. You are letting the night take over, confident that the library will still be there in the morning, guarding its secrets while the world sleeps. The air is stilling even further. The distant hum of the city has faded into a single, low-frequency vibration that feels like the earth itself is purring. You are sinking into the dust of Baghdad, but the dust is soft, like powdered silk. You are safe. You are quiet. You are finished with the day. The journey is ending now, the long walk through the silent corridors of the Caliphate drawing to a soft and natural close. Feel the weight of your blankets as they settle around you, as solid and protective as the limestone walls of the House of Wisdom. The desert wind is just a whisper now, a faint breath of air that carries away the last of your modern worries, leaving only the cool, silver peace of the moonlight. Your breathing is slow, a rhythmic tide that matches the gentle flow of the Tigris, rising and falling in the perfect, effortless logic of a mathematical proof. The ink has dried on the page, the lamps have burned low, and the master librarians have finally tucked their hands into their sleeves and closed their eyes. There are no more equations to solve, no more stars to map, and no more maps to draw. The world is small, the world is known, and the world is very, very quiet. You are drifting into a deep, dreamless archive of your own, where the only sound is the soft rustle of your own breath. Let the shadows lengthen, let the colors fade to charcoal and amber, and let yourself go into the stillness. You are resting in the heart of the golden age, and the night is long and kind.